Welcome to Trending in Education. Mike Palmer here. I'm delighted to be joined by Lindsay Whorton, who's the president of the Holdsworth Center, a nonprofit based here in lovely Texas, just outside of Austin. We're both here for South by Southwest EDU. Welcome to the podcast, Lindsay.
Thanks so much for having me.
It's amazing to have you. We always start with the rite of passage of you sharing your origin story, your professional origin story, although feel free to share whatever you'd like, just so our listeners, viewers get a sense of who you are.
Professional origin story sort of blends with personal because I grew up in Independence, Missouri, and knew very early on that I wanted to be a teacher. In fifth grade, I had an experience tutoring a student who sat right behind me, and it was really meaningful, and also just helped me realize that teaching was this opportunity that blends so many strengths and talents and passions.
Yeah.
And so sort of set off, committed to do that, never wavered. Played college basketball. We talked a little bit about that.
Yeah.
Studied to be a teacher, was just passionate about being a high school English teacher and coach.
Yeah.
And then my career path diverged a little bit because I had a chance to go to grad school and spent 4 years abroad studying international education and really walked away with a very basic conclusion from all of that time, which is that all of the education systems around the world, they get the kind of results that we aspire to.
Yeah.
High levels of achievement, low levels of variation. The variation in achievement isn't predictable by how much education your parents had, where they live, what their race is, how much money they make. The one thing all those systems have in common is that they all have made what I would call generational investments in people. They've taken really seriously how you identify and develop the teachers and principals.
And this is like Scandinavia and Singapore.
All over the world. I think these are common patterns. And I think people get kind of nervous about international comparison because how can you draw a conclusion? But I think about international comparison as a thought experiment on the assumptions that we make.
Yeah.
And I think the US has tried to do a lot of things to improve schools. But I think the one thing it's never really figured out how to do in a serious way is elevate the profession. And so, when I met Charles Butt, who is famously known for HEB, the retail company here in Texas, but is also a really big champion of public education. I learned about his vision for Holdsworth, and it really was all about developing and building the skill of the people who work at our schools and our districts. That's a theory of action that I really believe in. I think there are other things that we need to do to improve schools too. None of them are going to make a difference if we don't figure out how to invest in and retain the great people who work in our schools. So that's what we've been doing after the last 10 years, and what inspired me to move to Texas and be part of it.
That's amazing. And just a quick note on the sports background. You mentioned coaching too. So like it sounds like it's been an important through line in your life.
Yeah. I think I learned a lot of, I feel sometimes kind of embarrassed talking about sports, especially in Texas, that I think at times take sports too seriously. Take sports seriously in the wrong way.
I've seen Friday Night Lights, Clear Eyes, Full Heart. I know.
I get nervous about that. But at the same time, I learned really powerful lessons through playing sports. And I think the reframe on Texas is, I think if we focus on the role that sports can play in building character, building leadership, building confidence, I think it's a really powerful part of the educational experience. But we've got to think about it as a part of the educational experience. And
not its own thing. Yeah. Because even when you're mentioning coaching, maybe think about it as well. Because like, it almost sounds like Holdsworth's a little closer to like a leadership coaching kind of idea. At least that's part of what's there. And then it also sounds like, if I'm hearing you right, we're not just talking professional development. We're talking almost a reimagining, restructuring, refactoring of how K-12 should operate.
Yeah. I think what's always been true for Holdsworth is we've tried to approach the leadership development side of things through an idea that's been around for a long time, the Center for Creative Leadership, coined the 70-20-10 model. The idea that you actually learn most of your leadership skills through doing your job. 20% through coaching, 10% through sessions. We've always tried to build programs that reflect that, which means what we do on campus only works if you take it back and you do something in your school. We take that really seriously. But I do think over the last 5 years, what I really thought about is the risk that those of us who do leadership development accidentally send the message that if you just worked harder or were more effective, everything would work out. And that's not a message that I really want to send to a superintendent or a principal. And I do think we've started to really think about how are these roles designed and how might these roles need to change in order for us to be able to develop people who can succeed and sustain themselves in the med skill. And I think all the data that we see on the teaching profession, on principals, on superintendents tells us that we've got some deeper that we need to face. And so I think we're trying to take that on as well.
Yeah, and a lot of the conversation, rightly so, has been about teachers, but there are also problems up the chain within the K-12 system. And then also part of why the teachers either burn out or leave is that there aren't really pathways built into their career.
Yeah, I think the problems that we see with the teaching profession and the challenges facing principals are linked. And then you bring in the career pathways piece.
Yeah.
Because I would argue the data tells us that part of why teachers leave may be because of pathways, opportunities to earn more money, more responsibility. But the other reason why we know teachers leave is because they feel like they're not being successful. They feel like they're working really hard, they're not making progress. They may not feel like they have support in their role. And a lot of times that's a function of teachers not receiving the level of support, coaching, mentorship, on the job training that they need to feel really confident. And I think that problem has always been a challenge in schools, but is going to become a lot more pronounced as we look at where the teaching profession is going. I think Texas is, and I think there's more pressures that are going to come. But at the same time, if we are telling a principal, your job is to be the primary person who provides coaching, support, feedback, and mentorship to all of the teachers in your school building, which an average school in the U.S. has 36 teachers. That's not a possible expectation. And so it's both why teachers aren't getting the support that they need, and it's why principals feel like their jobs are so overwhelming and so difficult. And you see similar levels of chronic stress and burnout.
And turnover, I imagine, too, because like churn is a real problem at that level. Last year, I was part of the New York State School Board Association conference, and I was my first real exposure to some of the challenges that school boards face. And one of the main things they talked about was just finding superintendents and dealing with what happens when they leave, and that's where I imagine having an organization like yours who is thinking about this. And it sounds like at its foundation, it might be a job design problem. I worked at Kaplan, so I think like org design. Can you talk a little bit about that? And then also your model, because it sounds like you have a campus and that's part of how this all works within Texas.
So I'll talk about our kind of work and our current approach. And then the question about the model is kind of where we're going next.
Okay.
So we were created in 2017 to focus on leadership for public schools. And we started with a real focus on the principal. And the way that we tried to tackle that was by building districts capacity to develop future and sitting principals in the system. So we run these really comprehensive long-term programs that focus on district leaders and principals and their teams and really try to help build new systems and habits that can sustain afterwards. So we've done that since 2017 and had a lot of success with it. And as we've grown, we've seen more opportunities, more needs. And so in 2020, we saw the headlines that everyone else saw around the superintendent role. And we saw a bunch of folks who had graduated from our programs who were relatively early in their career, really high potential, moving into superintendent positions. And we thought, that's a really difficult job. And those folks need more support. And so we started by trying to create a program to support them. And then over the last 5 years, we've really built that out to try to think comprehensively about how we identify people who have the potential to be great superintendents, how we start working with them early and help them build the skills to be able to succeed in the job, acknowledging that the job in superintendent today is just not the same as what it was in 1980. And also trying to draw attention to that and help people embrace what the job is and build the skills to succeed. So it's been really that focus on principals, superintendents. We've worked with almost 3,000 leaders over the last 8 years, but Texas is really big. We're still not very far towards, the size of the problem.
But it does sound like maybe there's a little bit of a reimagining that's happening at both the classroom level, maybe at the school level with the principal, and then also at the district level, that it's almost like evolving past like a command and control, like number one alpha at the top. And instead it's more like, what supports exist and what kind of relationships and mentoring is necessary to kind of help support the whole ecosystem, how would you characterize things?
Yeah, I'll start at the district level.
Yeah.
I mean, I think with the superintendent, what we're really trying to focus on is moving away from what I would describe as our preferred mythical dreams of what the job of the superintendent is,
Yeah.
which I would call the dream of the chief teacher.
Yeah, you hear academic leader a lot.
Yeah, I got into this work because I love kids and love instruction, and what I want to do is just do that work on a greater and greater scale. And I think when you look at where school districts are today, how divisive education has become,
Yeah.
the way that social media and alternative media forms create, in positive ways, so many more opportunities for people to chime in and participate in what's going on in school.
Yeah.
But it requires so much more attention and engaging the community. We think that we need to evolve from thinking of the superintendent as chief teacher to thinking of the superintendent closer to the mayor.
Yeah.
You know, a person who's responsible for understanding the needs, the preferences, the desires of the community, for uniting the community around a common vision of what needs to be achieved, and just building a team of people who can do the work of building the schools that we need, of achieving the goals, of advancing the priorities that ensure that every kid gets the education they deserve. And I think that's been true for longer, than just the last couple of years. But I think at times we're afraid to talk about the superintendent in that way because we're afraid that then people won't want to do that. And I think there's an opportunity to really recast that and to say there's a real moral purpose in calling and being a person who brings her community together around a vision for kids.
Right.
And if you can embrace that and you can delegate some of the other work to other people, now you can do one job that maybe is sustainable and that you can stay in instead of trying to do two jobs.
Right.
Which is what I think we've set a lot of superintendents up to do.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where we start, superintendent level. And it requires the superintendent to think a lot about who's my team and who am I going to count on to do some of the work, that I might want to do in the past.
You got to learn to pass the rock, Lindsay. Yeah.
Now, when it comes to schools, I think we're in the early stages of doing some new thinking about what that might look like. But there's some similar elements to how we talked about the superintendent role, which is really thinking about two things. One, what is the work that really only a principal can do? And how do we enable the principal to focus on and embrace that work?
Yeah.
And what additional capacity do we need in a school to make sure that the principal can do that? And I would argue, we need principals to be able to spend more time thinking about where does the school need to be in 2 or 3 or 5 years and how are we going to get there?
Yeah.
And if the principal's spending all of their time thinking about how am I going to get my teachers the support and the skills that they need this week, our schools are never going to have the time and capacity to think longer term. But the principal can't just stop coaching and supporting their teachers. And so we think we need to invest in some new leadership roles on the campus that could really specialize in doing that work and doing it well.
Yeah.
But we've had a tendency, and to be clear, I'm not the first person to say something like that. We've talked about teacher leadership for years and years, but we've had a tendency to treat teacher leadership or treat different ideas like a barnacle that we just stick onto the system, where everybody keeps doing the same thing. And just like stick something in there.
Right. It's kind of the knock on professional development.
Yeah. And I think, one, if we don't think coherently about how all of these different people work together to achieve the results of the school, it's not going to work. And 2, when we stick things in just as an add-on, we usually have a hard time paying for it over time. And so we're really doing some new work. And I've got a book that's going to come out this summer and fall to really introduce a framework for how school districts can think about different ways to build up leadership structures in their schools.
First off, we offer a refrigerator magnet for your third appearance. So it sounds like the book and then +1 before you know it, so that's the first thing. But then secondly, it does sound like my background is more private sector.
Yeah.
And the way the private sector thinks about leadership, thinks about org design, thinks about mentoring and professional pathways is vastly different from higher ed and vastly different from K-12. How do you think about what you can learn and perhaps borrow from some of the other spaces that are out there?
We think you can learn a lot from other spaces. And it kind of speaks to the comment I made about international comparison before, which is I think we get into trouble when we talk is that you can just pick up something someplace and plop it down. And it's that simple. I don't think that's how it works. But I think we can use other industries as a check on our thinking. And we can ask, why couldn't it be true?
Right.
Or why are we convinced that schools are the only place where X is true?
Right.
And a good example, I try not to use a lot of private sector jargon.
Yeah.
I think we lose people, but accommodating in the private sector spans of control.
Sure.
How many people can one person manage coach support well?
Yeah.
And if you look at knowledge workers or people who do work on computers, trade in ideas, the average span of control is 6 or 7.
Yep.
And I would just ask, I think teaching is a far more complex, intellectually intensive exercise.
Also, it's emotional work too.
Than most of the knowledge worker jobs that we're talking about.
Yeah.
Why would we expect a principal to be able to support more teachers than we would expect the manager of a group of engineers? And so I think that's one example where from an org design standpoint, we may not just pick up the idea and plop it down, but I think we should start noticing the ways in which we design schools in ways that we haven't designed any other organizations. And particularly as the average intern teacher continues to change, I don't think that the models that have worked for us 20 or 30 years ago are going to survive. So we've got to ask this question.
Because a lot of the perception of the role of the teacher is that you're kind of isolated, it's a lonely job, and then management is kind of the administration's in your hair, they give you work to do, but that's very different than a healthy, engaged, professional organization. And I won't use much more jargon, but I do want to add agile. Agile's hot. Agile's hot in higher ed. And the thing that's interesting as I talk to school leaders and folks in the K-12 space, there's this concept in Agile called MBWA, management by walking around. And I feel like in some ways, that's kind of baked into a lot of these jobs, especially to do it well. You kind of have to be, you can't be in your room, your office, like coming up with PowerPoints to present to your board. Like those problems are more private sector problems. Is it a place where nonprofits are really kind of needed, I guess? Because it almost feels like, you have school boards and then you have the district level and then you have the principal, but it does feel like connecting the dots within the K-12, the federal and state role is kind of up in the air. So it does seem like a place where the role that nonprofits and philanthropy might be able to play could be impactful.
The way I think about our role as a nonprofit is, one, I think nonprofits have to take seriously their responsibility to say things that people working in the system can't say.
Yes.
So
that sets you up for podcasting, Lindsay, by the way.
Well, if you're a principal, you can't say, my job is impossible. But I can say that.
Sure.
And so I think that's a role that we're trying to take seriously. Because I think that there are some things that people outside the system shouldn't be doing taking lead on, but I think that's a role that we can play. And then I think the other role that nonprofit organizations can play, but we have to be careful about it because there's a risk here, is we have time to think about things that you don't have time to think about if you are in the kind of pressure and the crush of the day-to-day work. And so I think, this framework that we're trying to create is an attempt to set schools and districts up to be able to do work that we know they want to do and that they have the skill and the capability to figure this out, but they really just don't have very much time within their structure. But then I think that's where the temptation is. We have to be careful on nonprofits not become organizations whose ideas become so disconnected from reality because we have so much time to think about it. And then we have to remember that we can only take it so far. And then we have to bring those ideas and we have to let the experts or the people who work in schools and in districts say, this is how it would work. This is what you're right about. This is what you're not right about. And I think that has to be.
Yeah. And you hear a lot of terms like co-design and kind of empowering the teachers and like even the students, the community. And that is where it is like a public service role to be leading a district or to be, in a principal's role. We haven't talked about your model and we haven't talked about AI. So I think it's 2025. We're at an education conference. We have to at least get a take on AI. And then I'd love to hear a little more about how your model is evolving.
Let's do AI first. I am not a technologist. And so I think I tend to probably be on the more skeptical side of some of the big claims. And I worry that we're hoping for too much with AI and expecting a greater level of change.
I've been quoting Mean Girls and my listeners have heard me. We're trying to make fetch happen.
Now, I think the part as it relates to our work that I am really curious about is where are there opportunities for us to use technology to allow teachers and assistant principals and principals and district leaders to automate some things that currently take up huge amounts of their time.
Yeah.
Not the things that are most connected to their expertise in teaching and learning. I think I'm real hopeful that is, I tend to believe that, and I think even the folks who are kind of furthest out on AI, I would say this, that human relationships are going to continue to be the core of a school. And if you believe even the most kind of aggressive predictions, if AI hollows out, a lot of the kind of technical capabilities that we've trained students to do historically through K-12, through higher ed, what will become the most important things that we train children to do are the human things, thinking and relating and communicating, and a lot of the liberal arts kind of components of our curriculum. So I don't believe AI will ever replace the human.
Yeah.
And I think the question is, how do we allow the humans to increasingly focus on the thing that they're the best at, and allow the technology to supplement
and maybe address some of the job design problems by pulling out some of the low yield, time consuming, mission tasks that our educators have to power through. All right, we made it through AI. Where are you heading with the model?
Well, we run a ton of programs, and so it is hard.
There's no one answer.
The model. I think where we are focused in the next 5 years is we will continue to really be focused on this question of how do you identify and develop superintendent first schools.
Yeah.
We think we're going to need a lot of them. We think we overlooked a lot of people who could be excellent superintendents.
Right.
And we think if we can identify folks early and encourage them, there are people who can be great in that job who don't currently pursue it. And so that's going to be a big and exciting part of our work. This is where I get really excited about being in Texas in particular, because if you look at a lot of our efforts to invest in sitting our future superintendents in the country, they tend to have been national efforts. And as a result, they tend to be focused on developing folks for like the 50 largest school districts, which tends to be a very particular.
Like urban kind of,
And I think Texas is really unique because Texas is a fairly kind of closed system. If you look at where superintendents come from, they mostly come from in Texas, which means the future superintendent, both the 1,000 student district and the 100,000 student district, is in Texas right now. But there's nobody who sort of is responsible for thinking about the end-to-end of how you identify, develop, place, and support people. And we think we can do that, and that Texas is a big enough place to build kind of a critical mass that can really shape the future of superintendency. And so we're really excited about that piece. We'll continue to be focused on the principal. We've got some new programs that we're going to create to try to do some really job-embedded development. We're like an apprenticeship for folks who may already have their certification, but who need to really elevate their skills. Who may be in assistant principal roles or teacher roles, particularly in rural areas. And then I think the third piece that we're excited about is, can we work with some schools and districts who want to think differently about how they're staffing their schools and want to think differently about how they develop leaders, warming them up.
And then I guess, as goes Texas, so could go the country. Is that the thinking? Because it does, when you were talking about the mix, like it does seem like the mix of rural and urban and some of the cultural challenges that you're going to face, in some ways, Texas is at the front lines of some of that. It does seem like if you can be successful with this model in Texas, there's some potential to extend it.
I think there's a few riffs on the so goes Texas, so goes the country idea. One is 10% of the kids are here. And it's one of the few places in the country where the population 0 to 18-year-olds is growing. So that's like one argument. Two, I do think that Texas is showing some leading indicators, and they're not all positive. So if you look at the teaching profession in Texas, I think it points to where the teaching profession is probably headed. So you see elevated levels of turnover in Texas. You see the incoming teachers increasingly not being traditionally certified. And then you see a kind of cascading of challenges that produces. And I think that folks need to think about how they're going to respond to a teaching profession that is moving in that direction. And hopefully we can all take some action that will put us in a different place in 20 or 25 years. But I think that's really long-term work. So I think that's the second way. And, to your point, Texas has a big impact on the culture and the politics of the country. So the types of things that start here do tend to show up other places. I mean, No Child Left Behind is like a great example of that. I mean, George W. Bush created that in the 1990s in Texas, and it has shaped education across the country.
Amazing stuff. I'm talking to Lindsay Whorton, who's the president of the Holdsworth Center here in Texas, in Austin, Texas, South by Southwest EDU representing here. As we wrap up here, Lindsay, some takeaways. We had a long conversation, great conversation, but folks may want a few key items to remember when they go on about their lives.
So I might begin where we ended, which is I think we've got to pay a lot of attention to where the teaching profession is headed. And I think if we're going to have a teaching profession with higher turnover and with more teachers who haven't had significant training and preparation before they step into the classroom, it's going to demand something different in terms of how we support them in our school.
Yeah, it's almost beyond a crisis.
And we can sit around and plan for how can we get back to what we think was like a better situation.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, we've got to have a plan for the situation that we're in.
Right.
And that has to involve huge levels of support, investment, and coaching in those new teachers. And that's what leads us to believe we got to think about what's the role of the principal, what's the role of the assistant principal, and what other leaders do we need on our campus, and why we think that's work that's worth doing, even though it's going to be hard.
Yeah.
And then, for us, the other big idea is we've got to make sure that we support superintendents to embrace a job. Some people have called it a job as a civic leader, and help them see that, be ready for it, and thrive in that role, because we know that superintendents turning over every 2 to 3 years is not good for kids. And we're at Holdsworth just really excited and thrilled to be able to support educators across the state. We think it's important for the future, and eager to play the role that we can in supporting those leaders.
Amazing stuff here today with Lindsay Whorton, the president of the Holdsworth Center here outside of Austin, Texas. Amazing conversation. For our listeners, we'll include links to the Holdsworth Center. And I think to, Mr. Rogers, when there's a crisis, look to the helpers. And it does look like y'all are trying to be those helpers who can really address the severity of the problem and come at it with hopefully a little bit of a fresh perspective. So thank you for the work that you're doing. Thank you for appearing on the show. Folks, if you like what you hear, let us know, tell your friends, do all the good things. We'll be back again soon. This is Trending in Education.